Leading the march today, and happy May Day.
Just thanks for inviting me down. It's a real privilege, even if I can't get the technology right. Anyway, I'm really grateful. The whole point about May Day is there'll be people marching all over the country today and tomorrow. We've got the big one in Trafalgar Square, and I'll try and get back to all. And meetings like this are taking place all the time, but in particular today. And it is a celebration of our history, that's true. The history of our movement, trade union movement, the victories that we've had, the struggles that we've gone through. But it's also a celebration of a secret that we learnt 2 centuries ago. It was learnt by the people working in the fields and in the workshops. And it was exactly as has been said before and been flashed up here enough time. It's the secret of solidarity. It was on our banners, basically. It's a basic secret that we learned, which was unity is strength, injury to one is an injury to all. What we chanted today, workers united, will never be defeated. That secret, that if we're together in solidarity, we're invincible as a class. That was the secret that we learned. And I suppose the discussions that are taking place today and all in the last few months and in the next few months will be how do we mobilise that solidarity again? Because this is it, basically. This is the biggest struggle. This is no exaggeration. This is the biggest struggle that we'll face and have faced for generations. I'll use this as a parliamentary report, if you like, but I'm sitting in Parliament now, and we're watching literally legislation whistle past us week by week, day by day, which is taking away everything. Someone said everything that we cherish in their speech today, everything that we hold dear. What they're basically doing is they're dismantling the welfare state systematically. And it is not done naively. This is a systematic plan to basically take away the welfare state, dismantle it brick by brick. And I think what we've got to say to people is that if we don't draw this line in the sand now, within the next 18 months to 2 years, it will be gone. We will live in a dramatically different society than we have lived up until now. It will be one which is based upon complete market control. It will be a brutal society. And in many ways, some of the elements of what we would describe as civilization will be undermined for generations to come. So what I'm saying to people, this struggle is here now. This is it. And basically what my role is, and I think what everyone's role is, as simple as this, is to go around the country and go around our community, exactly as Philip has said, to talk about how do we bring this government down. We've got to bring this government down as soon as we possibly can. Now, the reason I say that is because if you look at the last time we went through this process, the last major recession, the only thing that me and Alistair Darling ever agreed upon was when he said the last major recession was in the 1930s, and that's exactly what we're going through now. And there's a great book, we're in an educational institution, so there's a great book that they give you when you start economics by J.K. Galbraith on the last depression. And it was 1929, the Great Crash. And it's worth rereading because he describes the process of how the depression came about. It's bizarre, the absolute comparisons, the similarities. Economic crisis was caused by a group of bankers and speculators creating a debt bubble, basically, creating fictitious money when someone said, actually, this is a fiction, and the whole thing collapsed. And then what happened, again, bizarre coincidence, we get to take power in this country, a coalition government. The Ramsay-McDonnell, not spelled in my name, thank God, the Ramsay-McDonnell government, Liberal, well, basically the Tory and Labour coming together. And what do? The first thing they do is they cut public services. They cut benefits in particular. And if you look at Galbraith's analysis, when you do that, they turned a recession into a depression. And a decade of depression, of untold human suffering, higher levels of unemployment and deprivation that produced fascism, and then a Second World War. Now, the Labour and Trade Union movement's response to that was actually the election of the Attlee government, based upon the principles of the Beveridge Report. A liberal, but actually, if you look at the Beveridge Report, it does reflect a lot of the work that Cole and others did in the early Poor Commission reports. And what they did is they constructed the welfare state. And that's what's at stake now, systematically taken away. If you go through everything that the Attlee government put in place as a result of the welfare state, start with housing. Housing was a critical issue. It was one of the tragedies of the 1930s that people were living in appalling housing conditions. I was brought up in Liverpool. My dad was a docker, my mum a cleaner. We lived in Scotland Road. We lived in a private landlord slum, basically. Well, actually, we used to call it home, but there you are. I remember the day we got moved out into a prefab, and I remember the day that we celebrated when we moved into a brick-built council house, Parker Morris standards, and we had sufficient space. You had a bathroom for the first time, an indoor toilet, and all the rest of it. It sounds Monty Python-ish now, but I remember that within my lifetime. All that is going. Housing is now going, as you know. The biggest cuts in government's expenditure is capital expenditure cuts, particularly on housing. And in terms of council housing now, no one, as a result of the recent government legislation, will be given a permanent council house. In future, people will be on a 2-year licence, and your wages will then be assessed, and if it goes beyond a certain level, you'll be expected to go into the private sector. We've also had in housing the housing benefit cuts. Now, I'm not sure what it's like in this area, but I represent a working-class multicultural community on the edge of London, where I've lived for the last 35, 40 years. And already housing benefits do not cover the rents. So people have to make up the rent because the rents are so high from money that they gain from any other sources. The benefit doesn't cover it. Now what they're going to do, as you know, is cut housing benefit, match it to so-called level of rents in the attempt, they tell us, to force down landlords' rents. In effect, what it means is whole areas, particularly of central London now, will be socially cleansed. Working class people will not be given housing benefits to enable them to live in those areas. That's already happening. And it's putting pressure on outer London, and people are moving out of outer London to outside of London to other areas. And the areas where rents are cheap are the areas of high unemployment, basically. So what you're finding is this concept of social cleansing going on. So housing as an arm of the welfare state is gone. In terms of health, well, it's been mentioned before. This is the end of the NHS. This is the whole-scale privatisation of the NHS. They're having the pause in the legislation at the moment as a result of some of the protests that have taken place, and Lansley is possibly the most incompetent Secretary of State that exists in this government. So there is this pause at the moment. But they're determined to force through the concept of any willing provider. And what that means, well, I don't know what it's like in your area, but in my area now, the PCT has been abolished. Every member of staff of the PCT in my area has been given a redundancy notice. Only a third of them will be taken back on again. The GPs are now a Pathfinder commissioning body. They will be responsible for commissioning. But of the 80 billion in expenditure on the NHS, 20 billion has got to be cut in this coming period, plus the cost of the reorganisation included as well. And what we're finding is companies like Bupa are coming along to the GPs to say, we'll administer it for you. We'll administer this budget for you. I'm losing a hospital, almost certainly needing hospital being closed down. We think the private sector will start taking over some of those establishments that threaten with closure. So what you'll find is the commissioning undertaken by private companies, commissioning from private companies. And any willing provider eventually means the full privatisation of the NHS. In terms of the third arm, well, we're in an educational institution now. The concept that we had was education was a gift from one generation to another. Free right the way through, right the way up to higher education at university. Well, that's ended. You know, the £9,000 fees are destructive of ambition. There, in addition to that, what's happening with the closure of the Sure Start centres, but also the establishment of free schools, which are now told that they can make a profit, the free schools can make a profit. And the forcing through of academies means that the academies then have to ape and become something like the independent sector. Already there are discussions amongst Tory backbenchers, both in health and education, about co-financing, which means basically, yes, you'll get an element from the state, but if you want something better, either in health or education, you pay in addition to that. So what we're effectively seeing is not just cuts in the education service, not just fees, not just the transformation of education into a commodity, but actually also the full privatisation of it as well. And it just goes on. And this is within 12 months of coalition government being elected in some form, put together. And it goes on. Some of this stuff is madness. One of the concepts of the welfare state was full employment. We've now got 2.5 million unemployed, exactly as has been said, another 1.2 million going on the dole as a result of the public sector cuts. 1 million young people, as has been said earlier, unemployed, but 1.7 million enforced part-time or short-time working already. Now, I chair a group of economists called the Left Economic Advisory Panel, And it's a mixture of people like Graham Turner, who works in the city, and others, a mixture of established economists. None of them consider that we're going to rise out of this recession in any short-term period. I don't think there'll be a double-dip recession. I think what was happening, we're experiencing what happens in Japan, where we scrape along the bottom of economic activity for a long period of time. And what happens is that inevitably what happens, the rich protect themselves, and the poor get poorer and more get forced into poverty itself. And as a result of the struggles that are going on, people will look to protect themselves as best they can. One element of the welfare state that we introduced in the Attlee government and developed on after other Labour governments was the introduction of the ability for people to protect themselves in the court, so legal aid. People were legally aided so they could actually go to court to protect their rights. Well, that was cut 3 weeks ago. Legal aid has now been restricted to such an extent it will no longer be accessible by most working class people in this country. The other element, obviously, was the establishment of a system of rights, trade union rights in particular. Already you saw last week, some of you in Parliament, that Tory backbenchers were acting as outriders for the government to introduce new legislation to restrict trade union rights, either by increasing the scale in which we have to have a turnout for balloting, which actually, if it introduced for Parliament, only 34 MPs would be elected. But in addition to that, the restriction for certain unions in certain services, emergency services, and it was not just health and firefighters and all the rest, they also included transport within those sectors that they would restrict trade union rights on. So what we're seeing there is the systematic dismantling of the welfare state, and some of it is absolutely insane. In Plymouth, in this area, some people have been involved in the struggle around the Coast Guard privatisation. What they want to do is close down a whole section of the Coast Guard service and replace it with a communication system based upon computer systems that haven't even been invented yet, so putting at risk lives themselves. And it just goes on. 4 weeks ago, the announcement of further privatisation of our prison services as well. It just goes on, and it is stark and it is swift. And that's why I say this is it. This is the struggle. This is the struggle that actually has to be taken on. Otherwise, as I say, in 18 months to 2 years' time, it will be gone. And once it's gone, it's that much harder to reproduce. So the most important thing now is that we've got to stop it happening. And the only way was the arguments have been put forward. We provide an understanding to people about what's happening, first of all, and why it's happening. We put forward our alternative, and then we go into action. And all three of those things have to happen. Now, in terms of why it's happening, look, the argument that there is a deficit, there is a deficit. We're not deficit deniers. That's the whole point that has been said here. We're not deficit deniers. There is a deficit. But the reason the deficit is being caused is not because of high levels of public expenditure. If you look at I got the Treasury to publish a set of statistics at the House of Commons Library, where if you look at the graph of public expenditure as against gross domestic product under the new Labour, actually it barely tipped the levels in which Thatcher and Major were spending. That sounds extraordinary, doesn't it? But actually we barely reached, only half the years that New Labour in office, the levels of public expenditure in proportion to the GDP that Thatcher and Major were spending during their period. And I know that because I was arguing against New Labour because we weren't spending enough. And the reason that we have a structural deficit is not because we were spending too much, it's the point that was made by Sarah, it's because we were collecting too little. To be frank about it, too many rich bastards weren't paying their way. It's as simple as that. 120 billion is the calculations for the tax justice campaign that we've been working with for the last 8 years. Some people think 150 billion. The Tories now have had to admit the Office of Budget Responsibility, which is a bit of a laugh of a title, at least 45 billion a year. And what we've done is we have to engage now the wider community into this concept of unfairness. I have to say, we campaigned as a union with PCS and other unions with the tax justice campaign, and we're getting very little movement in terms of publicity around that. UK Uncut comes about and occupies a number of buildings and shops and all the rest of it, fantastically raises the issue right up the agenda. That's why they got nicked. Then they went into Fortnum and Masons. They weren't nicked because they were damaging or anything like that. They were nicked because they've been too successful at outlining and explaining and exposing what's been going on in terms of tax injustice. So our argument is straightforward. It's not too much expenditure. It's not enough collected. And so what we want to do is exactly as has been said, collect the money that's evaded and avoided. But also we want alternative forms of taxation as well. We put forward our arguments about land value taxation.